Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 6 of Organizing on the Side of Love. This is the final organizing module in this course, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the closeout at the end. So let's get started. So a lot of the discussion that we've had so far in this course is trying to curate a whole bunch of information about movement building and organizing to give some foundational ideas. There's a lot more to say about all of these other subjects. They're sort of like origins of a river, and then you get a whole lot of tributaries. So there's a lot more to know, but we wanted to kind of round it out with thinking about the bigger cycles of movements themselves. So let's just say from the beginning, like a lot of material we've used for this class, it's contentious and there's different versions of stories. So the concept of stages of the social movements are actually mostly attributed to sociologists. You can see that Bloomer, Muse, and Tilley, that's 69, 75, and 78, were all original contributors. As you can imagine, sociological thinking about this and the data collection has changed over time. So they were thinking about movements really differently in 75 than they are now. Additionally, a lot of organizers would say that they don't exactly agree with the quote sociological data, as it's not in their hands. However, I've noticed that enough organizers and people doing this work think this frame is helpful, that it's definitely worth sharing. So we're gonna share it in light of that, and then talk a little bit more about specific examples, and also maybe where we digress a little bit from some of this. So this basic picture, and don't worry, we're gonna go through all parts of them, but there's a couple different pictures, some of them more complicated than others, but this one essentially that social movements emerge, they coalesce, they bureaucratize, and then through bureaucratizing, they often go one of these 5 ways: success, failure, cooptation, repression, go mainstream. And all that leads to decline. Now remember, social movement is cyclical. So so declining doesn't necessarily mean it's always a bad thing. One of the biggest issues with the idea of stages of social movements that organizers have clocked is that it really makes it seem as though there's a merge and then there's a linear progression to decline and then it's over. So if we look at, for example, almost all of the social movements of both the 20th and 21st century, it was more like it cycled, maybe laid low for a while, and there was another round, right? So some people would say you can look all the way from abolition to the civil rights movement, Black Power movements to Black Lives Matter movement right now, that those are actually all part of one movement, from Harriet Tubman to now, right? That we're going through the stages again and again in different rounds. So that would be the biggest difference of opinion that a lot of organizers have with this chart. This is, again, a little bit too tidy and linear. However, inside of the rounds of social movement, I think it's pretty helpful. So, again, kind of covered this already. Jonathan Christensen crystallized a lot of them after the original kind of set of sociologists. This is a hot topic of debate in the field, so there's a lot of going back and forth. But the frame we're using, I think that Christensen makes it particularly simple. Again, we already covered movement elders often see the process as cyclical. Okay, stage 1, emergence. So this stage of social movement is characterized by little to no organization, widespread discontent, individual, not collective action, increase in visibility of the problems and suffering, the patterns becoming clearer, and some movement organizations exist, they're homes for the vision, values, and the work. So let's, I'm gonna try to run a couple different examples. So if we look at a variety of different moments in labor movements, you can see a classic emergence, especially in localized fights, right? So if you think about different periods of history, whether it's the 20s or later, as well as in the 30s, you'll see that there's little to no organization before there's union, but there's widespread discontent, right? There's widespread discontent with a lack of labor policies, no safety standards. there's children doing labor, there's at a certain point historically no weekends, right? And there's individual but not collective action. So a lot of people who know more about labor history could talk more about this, but you have what eventually develops into the tactic of wildcat strikes, which is actually spontaneous, movement-driven and momentum-driven strikes that are happening, right? You also have individual action in a lot of places all over the world at different times around labor. So people are, maybe one factory walks out, or if you look at some of the histories of different moments with the labor movement in parts of Asia, individual farmers burning themselves to death, right, in front of government buildings. Like, these are actually individual actions that are taken at different moments in history, but it's not the same as collective action. An increase in visibility of the problems and suffering, patterns become clearer. There's a whole fascinating body of work on how the development inside the Industrial Revolution of print media, of media itself, of the way that communication has led to social movements. Of course, we look now at the presence of the internet and social media. It's even different than it was when I was organizing 10 years ago. But if you really think back in the day, if there are major, mini class wars happening in cities and communities, how do people know in Chicago what's happening in New York, right, at a certain point in history? And then you look at how communications actually developed the ability to make widespread movement that wasn't just focused in one part of, New York City or one part of the shipyards in San Francisco, et cetera. So the increase in visibility of the problems and suffering moves in tandem with communications mechanism. But even on a local level, in cities, before the internet, before different forms of communications, the visibility and the patterns were appearing to more people, even through word of mouth, right? People were talking about the conditions in their workplaces, etc. Some movement organizations exist. So you look at, very early, again, printing press, or groups meeting in homes, or organizers working individually with maybe 15 or 20 people, or one factory that was really organized. You're going to see some organization even in stage one. Okay, so that was a very broad meta example spanning time and place. I'm going to run you a much more specific example so that you can also think about emergence when it's not cycle by cycle, but in one. Okay, so the LGBTQ movement, I am going to spare you all because I know that by now you've realized I have a particular interest in that history because I come out of that movement. But if you're interested, looking at the history of the pre-emergence and emergence of what became the LGBTQ liberation movement circa 1969, if you look at the history from the 1950s until 1969, what you find is very interesting, which is that it was clearly, emergence was a very long period in that movement. Little to no organization. People were closeted. They were terrified to organize. And so they had, really were unorganized. There was widespread discontent due to violence happening in the bars, happening in public places, in subways. This was before HIV and AIDS as a crisis. So a lot of the issues had to do with police interactions in public, being closeted from their families, living in fear of losing their jobs. And some people were taking individual but not collective action on it. But let's just be clear that the vast majority of people during this period were living in fear and were closeted in the community. There was not a lot of individual action happening that reached visibility. Of course, there was always people protecting and defending themselves in the community privately, but there was not a lot of visibility to any individual pushback. And then when you start to look at really more not till Stonewall, an increase in the visibility of the problems and suffering and patterns become clear. Now, one very, very nerdy little known fact is that if you look at some of the early organizations like the Mattachine Society and other ones that you can study, they failed to move from pre-emergence into emergence and into coalescence. And most people would agree there's a really specific reason why. And that is that they were going for mainstreaming. Their idea was the most conservative, centrist folks in those little groups. Again, they were meeting in cells. They were literally meeting in hiding. We're like, we need to just make a case. We're human too, and we're like everybody else. They tried to move that strategy and the organizations fell apart and died. Why did that happen? Because there was absolutely no political cover and support. Nobody actually believed that except the people in the groups themselves. Real talk. You know, even people that were like, I love my kid, who I know secretly I turn the other way, but I know he's going out at night. Even those people were actually not interested in any public conversation about how LGBT people, or as they were called at that point, gays and lesbians and sometimes transsexuals, right, would be, there was just no support for that. And there was not the resistance and the self-determined sort of self-love, loving each other, building the community in resistance to the context under people were living. So the organizations just didn't have enough bite, and they weren't ready to get out there. And so actually emergence failed over a 10-year period in the LGBTQ liberation movement. Okay. Again, some organization existed, but it wasn't really until those organizations reflected vision, values, and the work of what would become the movement. Again, I do have an opinion about this, obviously, about what were the good values and the good vision. But literally, the vision and values that came to embody the movement were not in the organizations yet. So they continued to fail. It's not until Stonewall, where there's a big, really trans women of color and, you know, working class LGBTQ people, there's resistance to the conditions. There's a sense that we're better than this. We don't deserve this anymore. We don't need to take this anymore. And we're willing to actually take it to the streets and disrupt the police, who are the ones who are actually doing the policing of the society, which we know is throughout time. The relationship of white LGBT people to the police does not actually change for most poor white LGBT people, but does change in the last 10 or 15 years for middle class and upper middle class white people. But at this point, there is unity around interactions with the police, even though it's happening at varying scales. So it is when those things line up that you actually have emergence. And you have lots of movements where pre-emergence, they can't get all the way there for a variety of different reasons. Stage 2, coalescence. So this is a visual from the occupation of Madison, around the labor uprisings there. Some of you all might know there was, 100,000 people at certain points involved in occupying the downtown area of Madison. And it was a major coalescence moment for movements in a lot of ways, although, it struggled with the before and after, but I think the visual is helpful. Okay, so in coalescence, what starts to happen is there's a more clearly defined discontent. There's more clarity about what the problem is and who's responsible. Mass stage, we'll talk about that. Unrest is overt and contagious, and mass protests show force, scale, power. So coalescence, let's use a different example, because we could have run emergence with the civil rights movement. But we didn't, but hopefully y'all can imagine what that stage would look like. But let's talk about coalescence with the civil rights movement. So when you see coalescence, you're talking about the planning and execution of the March on Washington. So tactics that engage large masses of people. You're talking about organizing in a variety of different sites that at this point then there's TV, so it's contagious. So you're looking at different sites of the South that are all kind of like feeding off of learning what the other sites are doing. So you have everything from Greensboro to Birmingham. There's a relationship between Selma and Albany, Georgia, right? Like all of these sites are looking at each other and looking at what they're doing. And that unrest is open. There's open resistance, and it's contagious to other places, to other leaders, etc. Mass stage just literally means like it's a stage where there's much more mass of people involved. There's mass resistance. There's multiple tactics. There's people involved in a much bigger ecosystem of movement. It's not as simple as, SNCC and SCLC and, a variety of different of the flagship organizations that were present and remember critical in emergence, right? Because SNCC actually did have the values of the movement. SCLC had the values of the movement. They were in different places, right? When you move to coalescence, it's a much bigger ocean because there's individuals coming into movement. They may or may not be an organization. There's leaders. There's new leaders emerging. They're playing different roles. There's localized leaders in all these sites.
There's arguments and debate between leaders about where the movement should go, but you just have a lot more people involved. And then most importantly, there are thousands and thousands of people who are walking to work, not taking the buses, who are making sandwiches at meetings so everyone can eat, who are helping raise the money to get people out of jail. In the civil rights movement, let's just note, a lot of those people were Black women coming out of Black churches. That it was thousands of people, especially Black women, who made Coalescence happen. You can't just have a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and an Ella Baker and a Bayard Rustin and a Ralph David Abernathy, and then have, boom, you hit Coalescence. No, that would still be emergence. It's the mass that makes it Coalescence. More clearly defined discontent, more clarity about what the problem is. So the civil rights movement did this so clearly and sharply, so it's a great example to use. Picking tactics that brought public dilemmas, which those of you who've read This Is an Uprising see how it frames it. The lunch counters, trying to integrate buses, lunch counter, very specific. So you don't have to have a PhD to feel like the demand is relevant, because thousands and thousands of people are dealing with trying to get to work and away from work every day, and are existing while being Black individuals, trying to have some dignity and power and safety in their lives, trying to make that happen, right? So it crystallized, what is the discontent about? Well, the discontent is systemic structural subjugation, and what is a place that lives not being able to have your lunch where the heck you want to have your lunch and sit there and be treated with some respect, not wanting to sit in the back of the bus, right? It's a manifestation. And that's often what people outside of movements don't understand. Like, this was not just about buses. This was not just about lunch counters. It's about finding what is a manifestation of the deeper indignities, violence, and harm. That happens in Coalescence. It's very, very critical, right? No matter where movement goes from there, you have to find places. The indignities of 8-year-olds working in factories, right? The indignities of working people having to work 13 hours, 7 days a week. Like, that coalesced to bring the labor movement a win about having something called the weekend, right? The indignities of not being able to vote, which we know is now a very, very contentious, because there are very little protections for marginalized folks to vote. And at the same time, it was, how do you manifest the indignity of that? And people say, no, why shouldn't I have a say too, right? So it's about how you crystallize that. Okay. Stage 3. This is how it starts to get a little bit more complicated. Bureaucratization. I mean, movements have gone so many different ways. So this is a contentious interpretation, but here it is. So this stage is roughly framed around higher levels of organization, and there are more organizations. So we talked about that a little bit. The ecosystem is spreading out. There are more coalition-based strategies. This is what people sometimes nowadays call cross-sectoral, right? The LGBTQ movement, the immigrant rights movement in the US, doing cross-sectoral work. What is that? A wider, diverse ecosystem of leaders, groups, and ideas, right? Again, the groups represent different parts of the movement with different parts of the ideology, vision, etc. Different kinds of leaders who have different priorities and different skill sets. In the latter years, now this I would say is not true with movements historically, many nonprofits with paid staff. Now, circa after 1970, that's real, but that's a more contemporary piece of criteria. The movement has more access to elites. I really want to talk about this one. It's very important. So that's political elites, it's financial elites, it's media elites, government elites, which I guess would fall into political. So that gets complicated in a variety of different ways we're going to talk about in stage 4. Common knowledge awareness is built. So common knowledge awareness just literally means that the movement itself has created a new norm or has created a new standard of what is common knowledge. So 5 years ago, it should have been common knowledge that Black people are being murdered by the police every single day. But in most white communities, either because people didn't know or because they want to continue to pretend they don't know, that was not seen as a common knowledge. The idea that we have a problem with quote unquote race and the police, to use the most liberal language, that would be debated on every media circuit was not considered common knowledge, right? It was not considered common knowledge that LGBTQ people face pervasive discrimination in places of worship, in schools, in their jobs at a certain point, right? The LGBTQ movement has been working to change that assumption, make it common knowledge. One of the most interesting ones is the creation of GLAAD, which was literally an LGBT organization that was, formed around the idea of, gays and lesbian alliance, I think, against defamation. So the idea was we were turning on the TV and we were seeing all the depictions of gays and lesbians at that point in the movement as demonic, as psychopathic, quote unquote. So this contribution to an idea of mental illness, but also that we were, quote, sick, there was something wrong with this. GLAAD's mission was to create different depictions in the media of the community, which in a lot of ways they have successfully done that. It's more complicated than that, but the idea that there's common knowledge that there are LGBTQ people that are parents, that are, workers, that are whatever. Again, kind of the just like us narrative, but also the stories and histories of the community itself. We've propagated a really high level of really different sense of common knowledge. And finally, bureaucratization, before we move to stage 4, always carries with it the threat of virtual equality. So this is a concept that even some younger folks in the LGBTQ movement are not aware of. It comes from the writer and thinker Urvashi Vaid, who was one of the first prominent women of color, the first woman of color to be the head of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, a thinker and writer, and legal expert. And she basically predicted in the mid-90s that the LGBTQ community would suffer what's called virtual equality. Virtual equality means that we're on all these TV shows, we're in these movies, we're in the public dialogue, we're more out, and so the majority of people in the United States believe that we have, quote, equal rights, even though we actually do not have basic protections. It is still legal to fire people for being LGBTQ. There is rampant profiling and policing of LGBTQ people of color. All these things exist, and yet the idea that we're equal exists as well. This is a threat that always happens in bureaucratization. So institutionalization from that phase can happen in a variety of different ways. And this sort of plays out the elements of stage 3. But let me give you, I think the LGBTQ movement is a real example of bureaucratization, where a lot of more access to elites was clearly present, more organizations, more leaders, like all these pieces, the threat of virtual equality, the mainstreaming in a way of the knowledge that the community exists, and at least a sense with a large set of folks that they're okay with, quote, us, right? So it's a very relevant, I think, a timely example of having reached stage 3. Stage 4, it helps us to understand that these things can go different ways, and I'm going to try to give some relevant examples or ideas about each one. Okay, so let's start with A, repression. Authorities use measures to destroy the movement. So I think this is one of the things that can happen as bureaucratization starts to build. So let's talk about the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army. Let's talk about Black Power movements. So the Black Power movements don't totally fit all of stage 3 because there was multiple movements happening at that time, right? There was a quote-unquote women's movement. There was a civil rights movement. There was the engagement around brown power movements, Black power movements. There was American Indian movement, AIM. There was a whole lot of stuff happening. So it wasn't happening in a vacuum, and it wasn't as simple or monolithic to go through stage 3. But the repression examples are very, very clear. So for those of you who haven't studied up on this more, I'm just going to touch on it. There's a huge body of knowledge. But basically, Black power movements are one example of movement that was incredibly threatening to the U.S. government, incredibly threatening to the colonial project of the U.S. And so the movement itself and the key organizations like the Panthers, the state saw the need to not only fundamentally dismantle them, but to try to figure out how you could buffer. So for folks who don't know a lot about Black Panthers, we could also use the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican struggle. There's a really similar work that the U.S. government did, but let's talk about the Panthers. So if you don't know a lot about the Panthers, these are folks who are about self-determination of Black communities. They started a breakfast program. They're doing organizing. And some of them are talking about armed struggle, which is, the U.S. government, Black people, armed struggle, whoa, So repression, one, they were completely vilified in media. They took key leaders and either murdered them individually or in mass. The execution of MOVE leaders in Philadelphia is relevant here. And other ones they put in prison for 40 to 50 years. And then, as well as using COINTELPRO, which that's a longer conversation that I'm not an expert on, but it's basically the infiltration of agents into movement organizations to try to break apart the factions. Now, the Panthers had their own struggles internally, as any movement group would, and I think a lot of people who were Panthers would say that. That's completely irrelevant to the level of repression that they were met with. And allies and adjacent groups to the Panthers, including a couple white folks, like in the Weather Underground, actually did a lot of time for this as well. In addition to the dismantling and repression, I think we talked about in a different slide that what happened with the Panthers was also key to the wealthiest white interests in the country trying to create foundations and a nonprofit structure that would create a service economy to buffer the elites and the dominant class from everybody else, so that there would be in-between groups. So that would just be like, let's cut off a little piece of the pie and keep people quiet and chilled out with that, because we don't need this level of revolutionary engagement. So that would be an example of where a movement declines or is cut sharply away due to repression. Side note, part of the reason it is so incredible that there is an ascending movement for Black lives is that the U.S. government and very powerful forces have tried to permanently kill radical Black traditions of organizing, to try to make sure they take care of and neutralize every single person that would carry that tradition forward. Clearly, they've been unsuccessful. Clearly, they've been unsuccessful in stopping the level of fight back coming from Black communities, which is why it's very important to understand that this movement is centered in Black folks building their own resistance despite incredible structural, quote, odds, violence, etc. It's not because a bunch of people who weren't directly affected decided that these issues needed to stop. So repression doesn't always destroy, but it destroys in that cycle, right? Second, cooptation. Cooptation of movements is very complicated because there's a lot of disagreements about if a movement's co-opted or not. But this is often associated with things like being overly dependent on charismatic or centralized leadership, leaders being closer to targets and authorities than its own people, and leaders lured by the promises of inside change. So we talked about theory of change and how change happens. But for the purposes of this course, there are differences of opinion about that. I have to center an organizing understanding of how change happens, which is that if we're talking about advocacy and services and organizing leads, and then advocacy and services and policy change can be adjacent. But if the organizing is not present, it's very hard to move the other pieces. So this one is always very relevant for our time and every time. I wish that this was interactive because I would ask you all the question, why would it be a problem to have leadership be charismatic? Or why would it be a problem to have leadership be too centralized? And then I would want to hear what y'all had to say. I'm guessing many of you would say that some of the problems with that are any one charismatic individual leader ascends quickly and disappoints quickly, because no one leader can actually continue to pull off and hold the expectations of a people, right? Part of the success of both the LGBTQ movement and other movements was that there was, if you look back historically, there was not one centralized leader. There was nobody to kill off, and there was nobody to smear through the mud and be like, you're either angel or devil, right? Human beings struggle deeply with charismatic leadership. Most of us tend to be very, very, very drawn to charismatic leaders and also resent them very deeply on some level, or admire them in an unrealistic sense that then tries to create an image of perfection. That's why you have difficult conversations that people still struggle to have about the realities of who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was and who people wanted him to be, right? What happened in his personal life, what happened in his marriage. This is not, those things don't need to be held apart, right? It doesn't need to be that, quote unquote, any of his personal life was, quote unquote, perfect, whatever that is, in order for the incredible power of his work to continue on. Centralized leadership, also, it's very seductive because it means organizations and movements can ascend very quickly. But it leaves things very teeter-tottery at the top, very vulnerable, because there's not that strong base of collective leadership. For those of you who have an interest in ecology and environment, I am not very strong in this area, but a lot of people I respect are. They talk about the same thing with the diversity of an ecosystem, right? You have one kind of plant, you plant one kind of corn, it's very vulnerable. It's vulnerable to attack, contagion, etc., diseases. Diversified ecosystems where there's different kinds of plants growing, there's different kinds of beings and animals living there, tend to have a lot more strength. They're hardier because no one thing is going to take everybody down. And this is, I would like to say, a squarely feminist principle of organizing. And we'll come to that when we talk a little bit about present day. This is not something that traditionally patriarchal structures of organizing have been good at all. It just simply has not been able to break the mold that there might be one, usually a white man, but not always, one straight cis white man who's going to come fix it. Is a prevalent view that's not only held by male identified folks, right? It's been held again and again, right? I often call it like daddy's going to come fix it for us kind of organizing, where then it takes away the responsibility we have to be the leaders we need to see. And people like Ella Baker back in the civil rights movement, people way before that have been pushing back on that idea for a long time and talking about collective leadership. But historically speaking, factually speaking, charismatic leadership and centralized leadership can do a great deal to ignite a base, excite a base, even mobilize a base. But to sustain a base and sustain a movement, there are very few examples where they have not failed at some point. Leaders closer to targets and authorities than its own people is a little bit different. So this is more when, you look at, for example, second wave feminist movements, very activated around, especially white women, but not only, right to work outside the home, the changing of the ways we were dressed, like Mrs. to Ms., cultural revolution, consciousness raising groups, etc. But then at a certain point, because a lot of that movement was dominated by white middle-class women, they were like, oh yeah, we win. What we need to do is we need to be at those corporate tables. We need to be CEOs of stuff. We need to ascend into, political power. Now, are those things not important? Sure. Are they not actually capable of moving change? Sure. But do they mean that the leaders are then connected to what is happening on the grassroots or people most directly affected? No. Movements belong to who's moving. And so leaders can easily be lured by promises of inside change. And almost all of us are susceptible to this. We go into an institution or a campaign or a piece of work, we're being promised that we can change it from the inside. It's very exciting. And we can pay our bills and take care of our dependents or our kids or whatever. We can tell ourselves, oh, we're doing a great job. And it doesn't mean it's not bad for us to make a paycheck, make it work, and figure it out. The question is, who are you accountable to and what mechanisms do you have in place to be accountable to that? And over again, we see through moments of history that there are, and in this specific example, white, straight, middle-class women who they weren't accountable to any LGBT women, women of color, working class and working poor women. They may have been like, oh yeah, let's do a fundraiser once a year, let's do legislative change. But they continue to work as though they were speaking for those folks, and they no longer were, nor had they ever been really, but at least at one point they were in more discussion and conversation, and then later they weren't, right? Okay. Co-optation, I'm guessing you have a lot of questions about it. I do too. I would like to hold up, though, to be less, negative about it. We also see amazing examples, even in our time, of people resisting co-optation. So I'm gonna hold up one. Alicia Garza, co-founder of Black Lives Matter. She gets invited to go to State of the Union last year, President Obama. Does she go in disrespectful? No. Does she go in being rude to anyone overtly? No. But does she go in being fundamentally impressed and forgetting why she's there, who she's there for, and who she's accountable? Absolutely not. So, the media rakes her through the coals because she's sitting there not smiling, not responsive, and later writes, I don't think the president's doing enough for Black folks. Is she doing that because she's, quote unquote, this kind of racist stereotype of like this ungrateful Black woman? Absolutely not. Same thing when other BLM leaders have met with the president, right? Or have refused to meet with the president. I've chosen different tactics. It's an engagement with, okay, you're trying to bring me in, but I have access, but I'm not confusing it with power. Just because you have access to a space doesn't mean you have power. And tragically, those of us who have not had the opportunity to be sophisticated or savvy in political systems, we often have to learn that the hard way. I mean, I spent years in the LGBTQ movement being, really excited when I would be invited to be on these calls with the White House, and then the head of something or blah, blah, blah briefs you and then asks your opinion and they do a focus group. Well, that never actually led to us seeing specific gains, I mean, I think there's a way that for so many of our folks getting dressed up and going to the White House and having, those classic kind of selfies from the coffee bar with the brunch, I'm in the White House. I don't have any shade. I don't have any problem with that. And to confuse that access with power is a grave mistake, because to be in that space doesn't mean you influence that space. It means that someone is trying to bring you in and either, accomplish their own goal of having shown or shown that you were there, or neutralize you, or in the best case scenario, someone inside the institution is actually trying to make a case for a bigger project that they're involved in, and they're bringing your feedback in to try and build a case for work that they're trying to do inside, which is a good thing. But just so you know, you're the focus group voices inside someone else's curation of a plan to try to move something to the top. It's not like, oh yeah, I go in and boom, I shake hands with the president and I get this feedback, and then that's how change happens, right? So it's not a negative thing, but it's an easily seductive, alluring thing that's really confusing. And a lot of folks that I've trained have been like, I just wish I understood that sooner. I really, it made me really cynical to go through that whole process. So it's important to know that people deal with co-optation differently. And there's some very interesting examples of people experimenting with it in our time. Oh, C, success, the most fun. I wish I had an example where I was like, this movement won everything. Boom, total success. But success we're defining here as goals met, and goals often becoming common sense. So I'm going to go back to, the idea, at least structurally, that people of color and women identified people should be able to vote, that LGBTQ people should be able to vote, that it's not legal for another human being to be a slave to you. Of course, we have, prison incarceration, and servitude, which is pretty dramatic. But the cultural conception that shouldn't exist is alive and well today. The idea that, people have the right to something called health insurance, that actually exists. The idea that people have a right to have two days off in a week in this country. All of these were organizing wins that were fought for. We talked a little bit, I think, in the first slide about that. So you'll notice there's a pattern. The goals of the working class were not one. Of all immigrants were not one. Of all LGBTQ people, not one, right? But the idea that there are some incremental wins, and some of those have mattered. In the LGBTQ rights movement, gay marriage was not the issue that I was working on the hardest, but boy, do I think it's a really great thing for thousands and thousands of people. And some of us forget that it benefits some people who are not just middle class, who are working class too, and who are working to have some basic protections. Now, that's very contentious for some LGBTQ people. They're like, we don't need to assimilate. We don't need to be like them. We don't need marriage. Yes. And goals can be laid out and won, and it's important to acknowledge that and understanding how movements move. Finally, D, failure. Oof. There's too many examples to go into here, but I think what's interesting about D is the way that it talks about failure, and some of the different ways it engages it. So one of the ways that it talks about it is factions, which just literally mean groups split off inside a movement and simply cannot agree, usually transforming each other into the enemy. And you're at a stalemate, right, where the divisions in the movement actually tear it apart and stop it from being able to move forward. Some people would say you saw this with the struggle around third wave feminism, where you actually couldn't get buy-in from women identified people across race and class about what the priorities were, and it stymied the movement as it is. Encapsulation. So encapsulation is also really important to talk about in this time because I see it as a really relevant issue. Encapsulation basically means you form a rigid small group. Sometimes people say cadre, that's a different concept. I think sometimes it's as simple as more like a clique, right? You're not actually interested in bringing people in. Nobody is quite good enough. It's voting off the island. It's very dependent on the social relationships of the people connected to each other. So that's another way that you see failure. I also think repression often results in a form of failure, not just decline, but it's really a failure to thrive based on other conditions. So those are some of the four kind of basic stages of movement cycles. So starting to round up towards the end of the course, where do I fit? So I bet a lot of you who've been following these modules and diligently been in touch with us and on the Facebook group are wondering, where do I fit into all of this information? It's kind of meta. A couple thoughts on that. I can't answer that for you. Sometimes I'm just trying to answer it for myself, but some thoughts. We don't have to wait for perfect leaders, movement, or organizations. There's a ton of information there about very unglamorous ways to be involved in this work. Unglamorous ways of involvement are the bread and butter of movements. I would encourage us when we're like, I don't know where I fit in, especially those of us with different privileges, to be like, wait a minute, maybe I do know, but I just read all those articles, but all of those tasks sound kind of boring and mundane, and I don't get to be the central protagonist and hero in it, so I don't feel like doing it. Well, 98% of this work is those tasks. So, and, you know, we can also often use not seeing perfect leadership or movements or organizations as an excuse to not jump in. So if we're waiting around for that perfect train, it's never going to happen. It's never happened in any movement. Even leaders who were adored were not adored in their time, and organizations that are revered were not respected in their time. So, food for thought. Real movements have many entry points. Again, many of them boring, but everything from giving resources, doing a fundraiser, starting a local campaign with 5 of your friends on something really basic, all of this stuff. There's many entry points. And right now, I mean, there's just so much happening. It's particularly true in this moment. Real movements hold authentic leadership of those directly affected by an issue. So in terms of thinking about where we fit in, movements involve a whole lot of people that may not be directly affected by the issues at hand. There might be a lot of other people involved, but they don't thrive if they don't have some leadership. And when I use the authentic, it's not because these people are more authentic human beings than others, but there's some authentic leadership that has some lived experience of being directly affected by an issue. You can't have a movement to end deportations without people who are undocumented. You can't have a movement for LGBTQ liberation that is led by the straight people that love us, right? You can't have a movement to make Black Lives Matter and think that white people and other people of color who are not Black are the center of it. There is no ally movement. That's an advocacy cause. And it can shore up a movement and help hold down a movement. But the pace and the thrust really comes from folks most directly affected, which is why solidarity work is sort of a different form of work. It's a different ecosystem than social movements. engaging requires flexibility, awareness, humility, and willingness. I think is really great for us to constantly be asking, do we have these 4 qualities and any other qualities you would add after taking this course or doing your own work? You know, when we even think about how do we enter movement, what can we do, what role can we play? Are we being flexible? Are we trying to build our awareness? Are we coming with humility, or do we think it's all about us? Are we willing to do some stuff, or are we just here to criticize? Really important to think about. And finally, we desperately need more people in the movements of our times. We don't just need more people sharing articles and posting opinions on Facebook. Not that, you know, it can't be an important force. We don't just need more people observing and studying in classrooms. We need people who are willing to do the messy, and I would say very spiritual work of engaging in movement, just showing up. We need people to resource. We need congregations to open up their space. We need folks to provide childcare. We need people to write signs out. We need people to help with strategy. I mean, we need all of it desperately. We don't have enough people in movement, and base building has in many ways gone out of vogue because many funders don't fund it, which means we don't have organizations with big bases, and it makes this work very hard. So is it hard work? Yes. Are we badly needed? Also, yes. And finally, thank you so much for taking this course. You might be a little bit sick of hearing my voice right now. I know that I'm a little sick of it. But I sincerely hope that it has been helpful for all of you, or if not all of you, at least some of you. I have been really impressed to get to just correspond with a lot of you. You've just brought a lot of really heartfelt questions to this, and clearly a lot of you are already doing organizing work and trying to strengthen your skills, so I applaud you and appreciate all the work you do in the world. So this is the final organizing module for this course. If you're not UU, but you need the course completion aspect, please watch the last 2 or open them and click through to the end, and that will complete the course. If you are UU, we invite you, if you want, to check out the last 2 courses that are required for all UU Leadership Institute online courses. Not all of them are, we didn't make these modules, but the modules come with every course. So they're there. And then this is the most important ask. Please, please help us with this. This is our first time teaching this course, and you can make it better for wider audiences, more meaningful, etc. So please do the evaluation attached. I know people always say that. I've done a lot of this kind of coursework in person with groups of that magic number of 20 or 25 or even 100 or more, but I've never done something like this online, and we do not see any point in doing this if it's not helpful for folks. So your direct feedback would be really appreciated. Got any questions with us? Get in touch. Yeah, take good care. Appreciate you all.